nationalism ends up erasing non-Bengali, non-Muslim others, particularly people in what is the Chittagong Hill Tracts. So they're called, there are various names for them. They're sometimes called Paharis, which some people don't like because it has certain kind of stigma attached to them. They're people from the hills. And sometimes they call themselves Jumma, which means people who do Jum or Swidden cultivation. Okay, so I'm actually going to refer to them as Paharis or Jummas. There's a lot of dispute over what to call them, these population of people in the hill tracts. And this population was colonized, of course, by the British at one point, and quite by the accidents or contingencies of history as a part of Bangladesh, although the cultures and the religions and languages are very different in that area. So like so many of these projects of the nation state, the state has always tried very hard to secure the borders with these Pahari populations. Now, what does this have to do with masculinity? It actually has a lot to do with militarization and masculinity and the way, and this is a very familiar thing, I think, all over. And then we see it in the Northeast, we see it in Kashmir, the way in which the military is mobilized and a certain kind of masculinity is mobilized to secure the borders of, to basically, in the name of national security, a lot of practices are condoned and accepted and encouraged. And inside Bangladesh, what the thing I want to share with you is the way in which certain kinds of kinship and marriage ties have been used to both generate and justify violence against women. So let me just start with the historical colonial stuff, which is that within colonial discourse, there were all kinds of stereotypes. So there was the effeminate Bengali and the Gurkhas, I guess, were big fighting people, then the Sikhs who were fighters, all of that. People in this area in the Chittagong Hill Tracts were the tribals, right? They were actually, basically called the tribal, various kinds of tribal people who were backward, but kind of exotic. There was a certain kind of stigma attached to them, but there was also a kind of stigmatism. What you see in Bengali culture is this idea of exoticized, sexualized Chakma women and Tripura women, kind of loose and sexually available with their bodies showing because the clothing is different. And tribal men, the stereotype is they're very lazy, they don't work, they sit around and drink all day, the women do all the work. Okay, I think some of us must be very familiar with these stereotypes, and you can just change countries and nations and minorities and you'll get pretty much the same stereotypes in different ways, right? So here is this minority with this. And this idea of this particular kind of loose morality gives a kind of license to Bengali men, in a sense, to be very, to engage in all kinds of coercive sexual practices, and take it as, I don't have my paper with me right now, but there's some very interesting quotes that I have about young men going to the Chittagong Hill Tracts, because it's a very beautiful hilly area, for holidays, and sort of being very sexually aroused in the letters that they write back home about, okay, here is this virgin territory and we will conquer it, and perhaps I will meet, it's very romanticized too, perhaps I will meet a woman who will sort of, make all my desires come true. So there is that. That's sort of background. That's a very non-military kind of background that I'm giving you. And then there is the military, right? So the Chittagong Hill Tracts and its women are collapsed into one another. And this virgin territory needs to be, should be conquered. And that conquering produces a certain kind of masculinity, a very positive kind of masculinity, right, for Bengali men. But it's all in the name of, it's all seen as, there's nothing problematic about that. So for various political reasons that I won't go into, this area has been occupied for a very long time by the military. It's been resettled by Bengalis, and there's been huge amounts of displacement. And in fact, instead of like 0% Bengalis in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, it's something like 50% now. And of course, this has not been achieved peacefully. This has happened through all kinds of military counterinsurgency efforts, including quite the systematic rape and military and sexual abuse of women. So that was the military doing that. One of the things that's happened, apart from straightforward military operations in which women are just there is a peace accord, so we don't really have this kind of thing anymore. There's something more sort of invisible. With the peace, there's been abductions and taking away of women, and there's a very famous woman named Kalpana Chakma who was abducted by a young lieutenant general. And the story goes, and when she disappeared, she was a very vocal activist. When she disappeared, people said, well, really, she really fell in love with the major, and she's run away. And it's actually a story of elopement. It's not a story of Bengali military violence on the bodies of Chakma women or whatever. It's really a romance story, and she wants to hide it. Because because her family's honor is at stake. So really, so that's a very typical kind of way in which a lot of nationalists want to recalibrate the story, right? So there's that. But what I found really interesting doing reading up and writing about this is around this time, there's been never, by the way, Kalpana Chakma's body has never been found, and this person, Lieutenant Firdaus, has also been disappeared. He's not been, so there's going to be, like as in all of, as in Kashmir or in the Northeast, these things are, these things go nowhere. So, but Kalpana, after this, there was apparently a circular. This could be a rumor, but even if it's a rumor, I think it says something. Apparently the government set out, or the military sent out a rumor to all its army personnel saying that army people should really encourage romances with Pahari women so that they can get married, so that these women and their children can assimilate into the Bengali nation. So the idea is there will be no more problem if we can just marry them and give them Bengali blood and Bengali language and a Muslim religion, and we'll all be one happy creature. And one of the things that happened after the rumor of this, and perhaps it's true, it doesn't really matter anymore whether there really was a circular. What matters is there was this rumor. It sort of legitimized all kinds of coercive relationships with Pahari women. Because you could say, well, sir, I'm doing this, I'm being a man, I'm being a good Bengali man, I'm doing this also not just as a good Bengali man, I'm doing this for the nation. So you can see how the discourse of nationalism and the discourse of masculinity then actually help to justify this kind of violence on the body of the so-called tribal woman. Does that mean, I'm sorry, but does that mean does that zero mean something?
Yeah, it means that you're close to your time.
Wow. Okay. I'm fine. I just want to say.
A few more.
Yeah. No, that's fine. Wow. So we're in this situation. One of the things about this situation, I think, and I've been thinking about, well, what does one do? There have been a lot of protests around Kalpana's disappearance, for instance. And most of the protests are very much framed within a human rights discourse. And I think that's fine, that's good. But I think it doesn't go far enough. What we need to do, and I'm not an activist in that way, but I think it's really important for academics and researchers and activists to then unravel the layer beyond that. How is this human rights violation enabled? It's enabled through this particular kind of ideology in which Bengali men are the protectors of Chakma women by abducting them and forcing them into marriage and assimilating them by force into the nation, right? And they become the heroes in the national discourse. So I think it's very important, if we are working on these issues, to not to complicate the ways in which we talk about this, whether we're writing in the newspapers or going to these communities or talking to feminists in the majoritarian community. I think we have to inhabit, we have to challenge our comfort zones, because I think human rights discourse doesn't always unsettle our own complicities. And I speak as somebody from a majoritarian community, at least in this context. In Bangladesh, I'm very much Bengali speaking, Muslim, middle class, right? So I have, But, the way in which my privilege is connected to that oppression, the way in which the military, I think it's very interesting because a lot of feminists felt very uncomfortable supporting Kalpana Chakma when she was alive because she was really pushing for very strong kinds of autonomy. It was only when she disappeared that they supported her, but they were, supporting finding her and punishing the army. They weren't challenging initially the premises of nationalism. So I think this kind of work really requires us to look closely at the ways in which nationalisms and masculinities are woven in together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. Despite the short time, and also the how sexuality underpins the analysis. I think both Sanjeev also mentioned it, you've also mentioned it, and it works not only at the micro level, it goes all the way up to macro and international, and it's the same language. So you see masculinity is being played out. And just one more point, I think taking these specific examples really help understand, I find. I think the power for a powerful source of understanding is to be able to locate the concepts with actual empirical realities and then take the analysis forward the way you did it. I think, so we have a lot of room for discussion further. Now I'll invite Lakshman and to remind you all again, and are you surprised, Lakshman? And remind you, the theme today is making the links, in which Sanam tries to do that, to make the links between violent conflict, development, and masculinities in South Asia. How we do it is a challenge, but I think what you heard today is really our way of showing out how masculinities work out and what sort of systems it make, and why then injustices are deeply embedded in the way masculinities work out. Yes, Lakshman.
Thank you, Kausar. I'm not going to throw out a similar, very knowledgeable sort of discussion here, but basically what I was thinking and I'm thinking is to do is, in fact, to tell you a little bit brief about what Sanam and link with the theme of the session today. The whole works with men and boys when we look at the history in South Asia starts much earlier, but then it began coming together from 1997, in fact, where some of us, our colleagues started coming together and to discuss exactly what it means when we use the word masculinities, and it was masculinity then. And then what it means for a region like South Asia, where there are such a peculiar sort of trends when we look at the violence against women, gender-based violence, sexual violence, oppression of women, oppression of caste, oppression of class, socioeconomic status, lots of multiple factors that come into play, and what that means when it comes to then the region whole itself. And then the why we're talking about the region is also goes back to the history, saying that the South Asia as such is has a interesting history where we all somehow connect with each other and at the same time try to define ourselves quite differently, either in the name of religion, either name of nation, which was tossed open, or either name of something else. And surprisingly, during the discourse, what also happens is that if something happens in one of the countries in South Asia, that impacts all other countries too. So it can't be looked at as an isolation, something happening in India, and we Nepalese sit together or we Bengalis sit together and talk about that. It doesn't impact us, but actually it has a lot of impact on the way things unfold in the region. So while doing this lot of discourses, one of the things that were really coming out was this experiences around addressing gender-based violence or violence against women. One realization suddenly we sort of started discussing about is that while we really grapple with this philosophy or the approach on how do we really work with men and boys and what it means to be more meaningful in terms of gender justice and gender equality, also needs sort of a sharpening the skills to of those who were developing the on-ground prevention programs as well. And then we also thought of we sort of then had an interesting history where really the academicians and NGO people really didn't come together, in fact, and we sort of NGOs were dealing with how do we generate a concrete evidence-based or sort of knowledge out of it so that we sharpen and deepen our interventions at various levels, as well as in the same time the academicians were sort of looking at space where do we really see how this knowledge becomes practice, so that it really meaningfully makes a difference in the lives of human beings as such, irrespective of what the sex and gender and age are. So, and that's where, and a lot of us started coming together with a number of workshops and capacity building events and etc. But, we were grappling with how does that connect together? Where do we sit together and share what we have learned or what we have really not learned or failed? We sort of thought, one of the discussions we were having is also that can we learn something out of this process that we are getting into or we have got into to generate a meaningful intervention when it comes to addressing an issue like gender-based violence or violence against women in the region, and addressing as from a masculinity perspective. And when we analyze these different tools, those were coming together from different organizations, all of us were working on this issue, saying that we are working on this issue, making positive changes, suddenly realized that there is not a common thread through which the masculinity lens was used across the interventions. And that wasn't understood on a common, sort of a platform as well. People were understanding it differently, and that's also good in a way. But then we were trying to grapple if there is some commonality, given the history of commonalities within South Asia, and how do we bring all of this together to make sure that, not really make sure, but try to grapple again further to make it meaningful in the works that we were doing in the region. And then this picture, which is quite interesting for me, because we came out with this, but for others it might be equally confusing. While we were sort of dwelling into practice and knowledge, and along the line, given the multiple dimensions that were just talked about when it comes to looking at masculinities, gender justice issues as such, we were sort of not really connecting the dots between knowledge, practice, and the advocacy works that we are doing in the region. And in the same time, we were talking about creating a momentum on or sort of reaching towards gender justice. We were also somehow looking at the relationships and how do we strengthen this as a relation within the region and the specificities within the region that are there. And then how do we bring the knowledges those were emerging out of the projects, as well as the academic sector, those were doing a lot of works around these issues. And that's where Sanam came together as a platform to offer this space where we all connect with each other and try to sort of connect with each other in the same time, and also agree to disagree with each other, because that is very crucial as well. It's not always constructive to all of us agree on the same point. It's always very good to disagree on certain points and further indulge into a meaningful discussion on what that really means to us then, and try to come together as a common voice. And that was what Sanam we were trying to come together as how do we connect these dots as a group. So through these processes, along the processes, it was such a smooth history as I'm just sort of narrating you here. It was quite an interesting process, I would say, and quite a learning and enlightening process for many of us in the group, and through which it also helped to some of us who thought we are experts on masculinities to really say that, oh, we weren't really, and then try to rethink that and try to be open to learning. Because the whole issue of gender justice, social justice is all about also unlearning the things that we have learned in the past. So that was the struggle, and that's what the focus of Sanam was along the line. Also now coming back to the issue of how do we reach to the point where we are discussing when it comes to gender justice, equality, or equity. One thing that also emerged out of the discussion was one way of looking at the issue of gender justice or looking at the issue of ending gender-based violence was not going to take us anywhere. So it required, people from multiple sectors coming together and generating evidences in different parts of the works that's going on in the region, and bring those together to look at this multiple aspects of reaching out gender equality. And hence, what the Sanam also did was to bring all these people from different social justice movement, media, women's rights, child rights, so-called any other rights groups, and importantly, and along the line came into the LGBTI social justice movement. And we thought that's very important, especially when it comes to the issue of addressing masculinities, because just the virtue of presence of transgender and the discussions around will actually help us to go beyond this traditionally looked at binary forms of looking at gender or sex. So that became an interesting process for us, and we did that. And we started grappling of what it means for us as a group when we talk about masculinity. And along the line, as we remember, we started looking at different theories, Connell, Kimmel, etc., etc., and then realized sort of what that we still, I don't think we realized, but we are trying to realize still, is what it means to be masculinities in South Asia, and why we use the word masculinities. And sort of we somehow come together with this kind of a definition of a masculinity, which refers socially produced but embodied ways of being men and boys in during the given the process or the pathways that each one of us go through. And we looked at the different aspects of how does one get socialized into these norms and value systems. Those reinforce certain types of behavior, certain types of attitude, and how do we come out with an innovation that really helps to unlearn and go through certain processes. And that out of that discussion came out an interesting curriculum that brings all these multiple but complex issues together to really understand the issue of gender justice and masculinities. So it brings all the things that previous speakers have talked about: globalization, development, customs, religions, media, institutions, patriarchy, sexuality, self and gender, conflict and violence. And then very important also is court success, and which also was another level of discussion, is that, okay, now we know, or we know at a knowledge level, but how do we translate those into practice? So that requires specific skills too. And then we realized that in this curriculum we need to have a skill section where we all will try to come together and also gender some skills. Those will be meaningful in different sectors and different areas of work we were engaged in. As I mentioned in the beginning also, that we in the Sanam Fellowship program we bring together people from different multiple areas of work when it comes to social justice and gender justice. So, and the idea of coming out with the curriculum and was that a critical understanding of methods, tools, and theories that formulate violence prevention programs can come together and can emerge out of the process, and also a knowledge base that sharpens the understanding that masculinities, gender, and violence need to be located at intersection of social, historical, and economical processes. So those were the two main sort of a overview of the whole curriculum and the what it entails when it comes to really looking at and understanding masculinities in the region. What happened out of and then we do this fellowship program, which is a very intense, almost 6-month process that one goes through. Try to unlearn and relearn and again learn these aspects when it comes to really getting an understanding on the issues of masculinity and gender justice, and really come out with practical examples that they can really implement on the same areas of work they come from. So there is a process through which they get mentorship support along the line to really develop the program on whichever the area they would like to touch upon. They don't have to address all of those. Anyone which they come from and which they like to further explore on based on what they learned during this intensive minimum 2 weeks, it goes up to 18 days of this discussion. And out of that, so far we have very interesting projects. Those have come out from looking at helping us to really sort of generate evidences as well as skills on when it comes to how do we implement these theoretical concepts that we often grapple with in the real actual life and how that translates. So far we have done that much, yeah, I think that's where I'll stop.
Thanks a lot, Lakshman. I'm sure there'll be questions on. Very good. Because as we started off saying that the title of this session was Making the Links, Violent Conflict Development, is that it's not only about theory or practice, it is bringing theory and practice together, looking at the way the language works to maintain masculinities and privilege some people, the social groups that are disadvantaged, and so we have many other resource persons also, but I think these presentations give you a good idea as to what is our struggle of taking forward the learning around masculinities. So now let's have questions from you, and I think if the panelists have questions, please feel free to ask questions also. So we'll take questions. I'll take about 4 or 5 and then have okay. Poonam is saying 3, so I'll take 3. See?
We'll forget that question.
Okay. Yes, I see your hand. Yeah.
My name is Sandeep and I work in India, Pune city, and I'm from Malegaon. And my question is to Poonam ma'am. You described very effectively about the women's participation in the Hindu fundamentalist organizations. आपको कोई ऐसा एक्सपीरियंस है जिसमें इनके साथ डायलॉग करने का कोई मौका मिला? क्या उनका रवैया होता है इस सारे एफर्ट्स के बारे में?
Myself Madhu from India. My question is a kind of query to Sanjeev ji. It was very interesting and informative presentation. And actually, the same masculine political discourse we witness in India also. I just want to know what kind of language in Nepal particularly is being used for female politicians, if there are any.